movement from place to place, but not crossing the street. It's moving from one country to another, from one jurisdiction to another, from one culture to another. It's a movement through time, it's a movement through place. And human beings have been doing it a lot through human history, so the last 5,000 years that we know of. History is a word that is also ancient. In the European tradition, it came to light about 2,500 years ago, and it's the word story or narrative or account is based in Latin, but the original word was Greek, and it meant researchers. So history is a story that has been looked into again and again for the insight it can bring into human affairs. I won't wax too lyrical about that, because it might sound a bit abstract, but it's open for discussion. What is history? And how is it that the experience of all of us in everyday life forms part of what I call the historical process? John pointed out that Australian history has an ancient dimension to it, that is a dimension of our First Nations. Is there anybody here in the room who has a First Nations heritage? No, well, we're all technically immigrants then, including me. That's where I'll start from. Each of us is a creature of history. So my history, as far as I know it, goes back to England about a century ago, when my ancestors were church musicians. And they were members of the church, which was the established church of the country of England. And so that meant that a certain politics went with their music. And they came out here about 1900, about the time of Federation, and still practicing music. I'll leap forward a couple of generations and just talk a little bit about myself. I began being interested in history, it's hard to say why, when I was about 5 years old. I suppose because it was dramatic and interesting and about people, and also it was sort of safe. I could read about all the battles and all the traumas and all of the great migrations, and I could be perfectly safe at home. The interest with history has carried on with me to the present day, and I've spent, as John said, a good deal of my time studying migration. So I'll start with, John's got an excellent shot there of post-war migration, which I'll come to later. When we say post-war migration in this country, we mean after 1945, after the end of the Second World War. But if we could go back to the convicts, John. Okay. That's the first fleet sailing out of Britain, 11 ships, which were not very comfortable, particularly for a certain class of immigrant, namely the convicts. The convicts were people who had been condemned through legal process to servitude in Australia Many of them had been condemned to death and had had their sentences commuted. Commuted means that they'd been, the sentence had been downgraded from death to transportation was the term. And that occurred in 1788. It's over 2 centuries ago. Australia remained a penal colony for nearly 70 years. And even then, migration was a controversial matter. You would be aware that migration is a controversial issue today. There's various levels of informed and uninformed debate about it in the community and in the media. It's always been controversial. Apart from the convicts, there were free settlers who had a little bit of money and came out and took up a little bit of land or exercised a profession in the towns. These people were called free settlers because they weren't convicts. And as the community grew, many of the free settlers came to resent the fact that they had to share the colony with convicts whom they didn't trust or didn't like or whom they feared. And one of the first signs of Australians developing a sense that they were Australian was through organisations called anti-transportation leagues. So these were the people who campaigned against the continuation of transportation of convicts to Australia. But the big population explosion, if you can call it that, came later, around 1850, with the discovery of gold here. Gold had been discovered in California, and many Europeans had flocked there to try and be free, to try and extract a living from the diggings for themselves, rather than work for a boss or rather than work on the land. Many people dreamed of getting rich quickly. Very few did, but the whole phenomenon was a worldwide phenomenon. It involved not only people from Europe, but also people from China. People from China came here to dig in what was called the New Gold Mountain, meaning the old Gold Mountain was California. People came from China to dig in the New Gold Mountain. They weren't welcomed. They weren't welcomed because of racism. Racism and immigration are two concepts that we need to bear in mind together. Racism is a cultural factor, a dislike of people of another ethnicity. But it's also mixed up with economic factors too. Many people in their way of life are insecure and they see immigrants as a threat to their way of life, to their standard of living. They see them as competition for work, for jobs and so on. These attitudes are not well based. The whole phenomenon is much more complex than that, but it doesn't make the problem any less real. And here we've got a Chinese digger. Digger is a very Australian expression for someone who digs, and in this case digs up minerals, and he's got a sluice and a watering can and also a spade there. And when they first started digging for gold, it was lying at the bottom of streams, and they would dig up the ore and put it in a sluice and then pour water down the sluice and the soil and the other detritus that they didn't want would wash away, leaving the gold. That was the way they mined the gold originally. Later on, most of that alluvial gold was mined out, and they started sinking bores, basically. What am I trying to say? Trenches. They started digging for real. And you can see the artwork there too of Chinese diggers, as well as the photos. That's obviously been drawn by a Chinese artist. You can see the Chinese style, and the subject is Chinese, and the subject is mining. It's probably in a museum somewhere by now.
I think it's National Museum of Australia, mate.
Good idea. The Australian colonies were 6 or 7, depending on whether you count the Northern Territory, which is still a territory, not a state. These colonies federated for various motives, one of which was fear of Japan in 1900. Japan was an ally of Great Britain, but for racial reasons, and because Japan was a rising military power, Japan was not trusted in Australia. So they decided to set up a national state, a federated state, and we still have a federated state. That is, there are states which are sovereign to make certain laws. Once they made all their own laws. But at federation, they gave some of their powers to the federal state. And those powers were powers like, principally, defence and some restricted forms of taxation. Over the last century, the powers of taxation of the Commonwealth have increased, and the Commonwealth has accordingly become more involved in other matters like education. And you'll see that debated in the press. This year is a very important year historically for Australians, particularly people of my sort of background. When I got interested in history, the first book that was given to me was a book of cartoons about Gallipoli. Australia rushed into the Great War in 1914, didn't ask any questions about where we were going and what we were going to do. Australia actually offered a fleet and an expeditionary force, that is, an army to fight, anywhere the British government was willing to send it to fight. We didn't ask where, who we'd be attacking, why we'd be doing it. Nothing of that kind was asked. It was just felt that we were so British that because a war had broken out in Europe, because most of the population of this time was still of British ethnicity, that we were involved. In fact, legally we were involved. We didn't have the right, politically and legally, to stay out of that war. Well, as you know, you may have heard, because it's been in the press so much, and it gets commemorated every year, a landing was made in Turkey on the Gallipoli Peninsula in April 1915, and it was a disaster. They had to consolidate their position by conquering 3 ridges, and they only conquered 2. And the Turks counterattacked them in May and suffered terrible casualties. And we counterattacked them in August and suffered terrible casualties, but obtained some objectives that made very little difference one way or the other. And the whole thing had to be called off by Christmas. but it was an important psychological moment in Australian history. That war raged in Europe for over 4 years and involved many countries, one of which is of particular interest to me, namely Italy. Italy got a terrible mauling in the Great War. The casualties went into the hundreds of thousands. After the war, there was a split community because part of the Italian community had not wanted to fight the war at all. And part of the community had been very determined that they would fight that war. And so there were a number of economic problems as well. During the war, the cost of living had gone up a great deal and wages had been held down by law. So after the war, there was a wave of strikes. So there was a lot of community passion and feeling about those strikes, some for and some against. And one outcome of that was the rise of a right-wing militarist party called the Fascist Party. And it took power in 1922, that little date I signed there. And one of the effects of that was a lot of working class people, a lot of trade unionists decided that they really didn't have a future in fascist Italy. They were subject to political oppression, which is something that we'll be discussing a bit later. And also work, there was a depression. Work was very hard to find. So a number of these people emigrated to Australia, and my main historical work has been to write the biography of one of these people to give an idea of what migrants go through. 1939, as a result of unresolved matters, this is Mussolini, the leader of the fascists, addressing great crowds. He was, for a time, he was very popular with some people. Another fascist party, the Nazi Party, went to power in Germany in similar circumstances. And as a result, largely of German foreign policy, a war broke out in 1939, ravaged Europe for 6 years, extended from all around the globe. It was much of the hardest fighting was in Russia. And that's where some of the greatest losses were incurred. I think the Russian people incurred over 20 million casualties. It was a pitiless war, and it devastated Europe. So after 1945, after peace broke out, there were lots of displaced persons. These people were looking for places to emigrate to because in the devastation there was not much hope of employment, not much hope of the future, and so John's got some photos there of the fighting in, looks like Stalingrad. That's the bomb that was unleashed on Hiroshima or Hiroshima. I don't know, there's probably somebody in the audience who can check my pronunciation. And the war ended not long after the dropping of those bombs. But as I said, the devastation in Europe meant that there was a large pool of people who were looking to migrate. You can see there what some of the cities look like. Not places that you want to live in or could live in. This wave of migration came to Australia. One of the main reasons it did was Australian fear about being a small country in a big world. And there was a kind of paranoia, a kind of desperate fear that other people might come and have a desire to conquer Australia and bring war to Australia. And the way to do something about it was to bring more people here. Racism played a part in it again, in that it was one reason why European migrants were preferred. The other reason was because European migrants were available because of the war. Australia, land of tomorrow. This is what this is a piece of artwork that was put about by the Australian government in Europe. And this program of promoting migration from Europe to Australia that went on and probably still goes on in a small scale today. And there we have pictures of, there's one gentleman up here I'll point out to you particularly. This is Arthur Cornwall. He was the Minister of Immigration, and the program of immigration. There he is. The program of immigration was very much his brainchild. It was by Australian standards at the time. It was a very large program. It was a large increase in the population. There he is, showing off a young new immigrant with a teddy bear and Australian wattle. But this was not the last war that would bring people to our shores. One that I remember very much when I was growing up was the Vietnam War. Again, that war divided Australia a great deal because, once again, there were those in the community who wanted to see that war fought and wanted us to fight in it, and there were others like me who didn't. And it was a very violent war. It went on for a very long time. In the end, there was a military resolution, and Saigon fell in 1975. Then we had the first wave of what were popularly described as boat people. Immigrants desperate to flee the political and economic situation in Vietnam after the war. And in a way, that's where we are today. There have been other conflicts, there have been other episodes of political oppression, and the world is now involved in one of the largest mass movements of population that's ever been seen. And although Australia's part in it is relatively small, once again, elements of the Australian community have not been able to cope with it intellectually. They've not been able to understand what's happening and to address it in any way other than through fear. So it's very controversial, it's very political. The government of the day has a very prominent political position about it, and it will be an issue at the next election, as it was at the last. So that's just a very broad, approximate overview of the history of migration to Australia. What I want to do now is try and throw the discussion over to you, because many of you know as much about this as I do. So I began by telling you, where my ancestors were from and where I'm from, and what my intellectual background is. I was wondering if I could perhaps just indicate a person and then just start moving around the room and ask you to tell me something about yourself, about how you came to this country, what motivated you, and thinking of that poster about Australia as a land of sunny colour, what you knew about Australia when you decided to come here, and maybe how you found Australia. Has it answered your expectations, or have you found it different, and so on. So I was wondering if this gentleman here.
Me.
Yes.
Okay. I decided to come to Australia, not because of the reason you mentioned, the war, the religions, the conflict, the suffering, not for that things.
Yes.
I come here just for maybe for more better environment
Yes.
to live in,
Yes.
and maybe the better job opportunities for
Yes.
us to continue my career in Australia, and maybe for my boys' education in Australia. Yes, my reason for
Yes.
my decision to Australia.
So compared to other countries in the world,
Yeah.
there's more opportunity,
Yeah,
and that attracted you,
yeah.
and also
I think
perhaps
so.
a history of conflict in your country, or
Not so much.
Not so much?
At least not didn't happen to me.
no?
But I think most of people came to Australia for the survival for this reason, because of the environment and the home country, and it's not suitable for working, for living, because of the war, because of the conflict. So the survival is the most important reason, maybe for a lot of people.
Right. How about you? Would you?
Yeah, I've been here in Australia for nearly 11 years,
Right.
so I'm already citizen here. The first time I arrived here as have a fiancé visa. Then later on, I went to university, then finished my degree in nursing, and